Welcome to Reading D&D Aloud with Ben Riggs and Dr. Scott M. Bruner. Episode 21. Is this the worst sentence in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide?
Greetings one and all to Reading Dungeons and Dragons Aloud. I am writer, historian, podcaster, teacher, gadfly, fan, and man about town, Ben Riggs. And with me is the transcendent, the translated, the translucent, Dr. Scott Michael Bruner. How you doing, Scott?
I'm good. Good morning, everyone.
I want to point out we did not talk about what we were going to wear on this podcast this morning,
Yeah.
and this is just a coincidence that we're twinning it up here.
Nice.
And I'm even growing in a little bit of facial hair at the moment. If you got some glasses. So Scott, what are you running tonight? You said you're running game.
Yeah, no, I run games every Sunday night. This Sunday is the Fallout TRPG, as you mentioned, by Modiphius. And it's actually it was kind of funny because I got kind of interested in wanting to run the Fallout game because the Fallout TV show kind of made things all Fallout seem kind of cool for a little while. So I thought I would run it. It was basically I'm running the intro adventure from the basic rule book set. It's been fun. I will say this. It's not one that I'm going to continue with. It's very, very crunchy and it's very combat focused. And maybe the funniest thing about the Fallout tabletop role playing game is that the company Modiphius only has the rights to use Fallout 4. So they don't have they don't have access to the entire Fallout intellectual property. They can't mention anything except for the things that happen in Fallout 4. And of course, it also means that they're trying to simulate the Fallout 4 experience, which is not one of my favorite Fallout games. It's fun, it's fine. I did finish it, but it's very combat focused. It doesn't have a lot of it's very combat focused. In fact, that's probably my biggest complaint about Fallout 4 is there's not a lot of alternate ways to get things done in that game other than to blast things. And in many ways, the Fallout tabletop role-playing game kind of reflects that. But it has been fun. I mean, the Fallout world is fun. I don't know how familiar you are with Fallout.
I'm 3/4 of the way through the first episode of the TV show, and that is my total exposure to the franchise.
Some of the games are fantastic. I actually I mean, Fallout New Vegas gets all the love. I'm the weirdo who actually really likes Fallout 3, but Fallout 1 and 2 were extremely important to me.
Which one is in Boston?
Fallout 4.
Ah, well, that's too bad.
The early ones almost all take place in the American West, which is one of the things that people were really grumpy about when Fallout 4 moved it. Well, actually, Fallout 3 moved it to Washington, D.C. It's fun. It's always fun to poke around post-apocalyptic wastelands. I'm not one of those folks who get really upset that they're not set in the American West anymore, but the earlier games are fantastic. Fallout 1, Fallout 2. I mean, geez, Fallout 1 came out in 1998. I vividly remember playing it on a Macintosh.
That's amazing. So, have you heard anything about Gen Con from the interwebs?
No. I mean, I've heard some experiences some people have had, but I don't know. And I know that evidently there's a new player's handbook that's been released, and people have been talking about that quite a bit. And people are liking it. People are, everyone saw the initial art and wasn't real thrilled by that stuff. But so far, the small YouTube, what I've dipped my foot in about people coming back and talk about the player's handbook, it's all been fairly positive.
Yeah, I mean, I all I did was read chapter 1 in the car on the way home. But I did think, and again, I am super interested in chapter 1s of D&D players' handbooks. Like, I really enjoy cross-referencing them and comparing them. I think it might be the strongest chapter 1. My personal favorite is, of course, second edition. Before this, I would have actually said fourth edition's beginning chapters were the best. But whatever we're calling this edition, the back of the book, by the way, says that it is fifth edition.
Really?
Yes.
That's interesting.
So I think that 5.5 is going to be fair. If they're calling it fifth on the back and this is a revision, 5.5 seems to make sense to me. But anyway, it is, I think, the best chapter 1 that I have read of a D&D player's handbook. And it's the only chapter I read in the entire book. Don't have anything else to say about it right now, but it is a good chapter one because I think that it would most successfully intrigue a 12-year-old that picked it up.
Sure.
And in many ways, that is if there's a number one job that text has, it's to say to a 12-year-old, "Isn't this cool? Play this." So you and I have talked about this a little on the side, but I don't know if we talked about it with our listeners. Um, you know, I have been like, I think that we should counter program against the player's handbook and all and you know, not I don't want to say not talk about it. I don't want to say not talk about it, but I would say everyone else is going to be doing so much on it. I don't know if people need to hear from us on it. But again, I'd love to know what the listeners think and what you think, because hey, we can always, do it anyway.
When does it officially come out? It comes out in a month?
Yeah,
In
like
September?
a month. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have some time to talk about it. I also want to mention uh that we are going to be releasing my 2023 fourth edition Gen Con seminar on the Patreon feed. And that if you join us for a mere $3 a month, you will get my seminars. I'm going to be releasing a seminar a month until I run out of seminars, and it should get us through most of the next 12 months. I think we have enough to get us through like 8 or 9 months of Patreon drops. And that is starting like right now. So if you have not yet subscribed, instead of spending who knows how much money to go to Gen Con to hear me speak, for a mere $3 a month, you can get access to that content, both, I believe, audio and video. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I do know audio and video. It'll be on Patreon, and if for some reason people find Patreon to be burdensome, tell me on Discord. I could always post it to YouTube with a private link, and we will go from there. But my fourth edition seminar, I think was outstanding, if I do say so myself. So please come join the Patreon and get access to that delicious, delicious content.
What was the topic of the seminar that you're about to post?
Fourth edition.
Okay.
And I talked to a bunch of the people who worked on fourth edition. Yeah, I got some really interesting stories and also some really interesting caveats. With that, though, I would briefly tell you that I think the story of this past Gen Con was Shadow Dark. Like I said to myself, I'm not buying any more OSR rule sets. I said I'm just not doing it. I have so many already, and it's not something I super play a ton. I just do it kind of as a fan and because I'm interested. So Shadow Dark, I was like, when the Kickstarter came up, I was like, I'm not doing it. But then it was so lauded, and people are telling me that they're playing it and it's so good. And the core book was like only $60, and I'm like, that it's the core book, it's the player's hand, it's the GM's guide, and it's got all the monsters in there. Okay, I guess I really need to go and check this out. And I'm gonna go on day one because I bet Shadow Dark is gonna sell out. I go to the Shadow Dark booth on day one. It looks like Henry Sugar has been dropping money from his balcony onto the Shadow Dark booth. It is so crowded with people. I have to like take shelter at the booth of the Wander Home people that are just across the way, to just find a space to stand. And I'm gonna say it's a 8-minute wait to get to the front of the line for the booth. Which the fact that there's a wait at all at one of these kind of smaller booths is shocking. The only other booth I had to wait to get into was Catalyst Games. You get to the front, Kelsey's there, signing every copy, shaking hands. Greg Helding was there. Baron DeRop from YouTube was there. I don't know his actual name. But I picked up Shadow Dark, and then I was like, I just said, what else should I buy? And they were like, buy this stuff. They gave me some zines and the DM's screen. And again, I've glanced at Shadow Dark, and so far I would say personally, I'm not quite sure what the hubbub is about yet, but I haven't played it, and that's where the proof is really in the pudding. And I've also heard the monsters are really where it's at, and also just its simplicity and ease of play at the table. Um, and again, like before this, I would have said the Rules Cyclopedia is my favorite one-volume version of D&D, and I would have never said that if I hadn't run BX. So I really feel like I have to run some Shadow Dark before I can really, have an opinion on it. But man, it destroyed at the Ennies. Like it got gold Ennie after gold Ennie after gold Ennie after gold Ennie. I assume that they sold out of their print run of the books. Um, but I mean, what an incredible success for a small indie publisher, in every single way. So, gosh, I hope we're going to see a lot more awesome Shadow Dark stuff coming down the pike. And again, they just seem like incredibly wonderful and creative people. But
Yeah,
you've run Shadow Dark, right?
yeah. It's my second edition group is we're moving to Shadow Dark, so I'm going to the long running campaign is going to be Shadow Dark. I love it. I think there's something about the access. It's the rule set is so wonderfully designed, so compact and so accessible, which is fantastic. You've kind of mentioned that, like the fact that they can put all these kind of like the economy of it is so interesting. I think there's, well, I recently ran some old school essentials. I ran the old school essentials module, Winter's Daughter, and I run that at Gary Con. And one of the things that I like is there's like this movement and it's so different than like running like Strahd or some of the other 5e adventures, which and it's a different flavor. I'm not saying one is necessarily better, but I was going to bring up Winter's Daughter in that when you describe a room in the module, it's like 3 adjectives, and Shadow Dark is very much in that kind of vein of like gives you just as much as you need. It does ask a lot of the dungeon master in many ways. It's an OSR type game, which it leans on. Everyone's heard the rulings, not rules, right? Not everything is in the Shadow Dark game. If a contingent situation comes up, you're not sure what to do. It requires the dungeon master to come up with a ruling on the spot, and it requires players to put more trust in the dungeon master, which I think is again, anything that brings, I think, more of the human subjectivity into the game rather than mechanics, I think makes games more interesting. And of course, it makes every game a little bit more unique and singular. But Shadow Dark itself, I mean, it's just kind of brimming with the kind of the aesthetic and the theme. And it is, I don't want to, it's dangerous. It's deadly.
Ooh.
You really feel like you're moving into a twisted labyrinth of there's kind of like arcane secrets that are there to uncover, and it's just I don't know how to explain it. It's I mean, even the term Shadow Dark kind of elicits this concept that this is a game that you're going to have to use all of your wits to get through, and it's fantastic. I don't know what else to say about it other than it just seemed completely obvious that this is it, it's very adjacent. It's funny because the rules are based on 5e, so like a lot of folks that are newer folks are going to be able to pick it up rather easy if you know the concept of the skill check. At the same time, it really feels more like BX or something like that.
Well, and that's really interesting because when I think about my OSR rule sets, they
Mhm,
are almost always first edition or BX inspired. And again,
right.
if you're new to the show, BX like there was the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons back in the day, and that's called first edition. BX was a series of simplified box sets that were released between 1978 and 1991-ish. I probably have some of those dates wrong. Um, but it was kind of a simplified D&D that was a lot of fun because it was a little bit simpler. But I can't think of an OSR rule set that was like, okay, we're gonna take fifth edition and OSR-icize it. Can you think of one? I can't.
Not off the top of my head, no.
Yeah,
I mean,
maybe that's it. Go
yeah.
ahead.
Nothing. I think there's OSR rule sets that have like picked and choose from for here there, but generally they've been using, as you mentioned, been going back to like initial rules, which generally, again, I think that concept of like the rules aren't the most important thing is just to give a little more permission for the dungeon master, to decide kind of what give a few mechanics that the dungeon master can employ. And I think one of the smart things that Kelsey's done in Shadow Dark is say, hey, the difficulty class system is fantastic. You can use it for just about everything. And the DM is smart enough to figure out how to use it and which one to use and what particular. It's interesting. It's completely different than Fallout, which is very heavy with kind of rules and mechanics and figuring out you've got to you've got to combine two rolls all the time. Then you've got to figure out how many rolls were successes. Shadow Dark just flows. It's still I would actually say of all the games that I've played at cons, because I played Shadow Dark quite a bit last Gary Con, uh, and I playing games at conventions is always kind of strange because your characters aren't going to go on. It's hit or miss of whether you're going to get a good dungeon master, but there's no game like Shadow Dark because it's so quick and you can run right into it, and everyone's generally on the same aesthetic channel. Aesthetic channel. It's like tuning into aesthetic channel. Anyway,
The sky
Shadow
with the
Dark
color.
is right. Shadow Dark is the best. Shadow Dark to me is the best con game because it's fun even in one shots because you're like, are we going to make it through this? Don't know. We've got to work together. We've got to make this work. Everyone lauds the one, and I do think it is a really really fun rule, which is your torches. Nobody has dark vision in Shadow Dark, which is fantastic. So again, this concept that you've got a limited amount of time, it really does lean on attrition rules. And the mechanic that people always find fascinating, and I think is wonderful too, is that your torches burn down in real time. So you can't gap at the table too long, or you're going to run out of torches, and the Shadow Dark is going to literally get you. Right?
So
there are grooves in the dark. So
I also
Zork
wanted
reference.
I also wanted to mention it was great to see so many podcast fans at Gen Con. It was great to see all of you. Thanks so much for coming out and saying hi. With that, I believe we are on Speak with Animals. Is that shall we launch right in?
Yeah, I'm excited. Yes, love this book.
If you are new, we are very slowly reading aloud from the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. And we are on a section where D&D co-creator Gary Gygax is giving advice on spells from the player's handbook. So to really understand what is going on with the advice, we have to go to the player's handbook and read aloud the spell that he is commenting on in the first place. So we are really down to the navel of it here, aren't we?
Yeah.
Go ahead. You were going to say something, Scott?
Well, I just thinking about what we were just talking about a second. People like Shadow Dark because of its economy, because of its accessibility. And it's interesting to me, the last time that we were kind of talking about the DM's guys is like, what is the rhetorical claim of this entire book if we had to like boil down with the advanced dungeon?
What do you mean by rhetorical claim?
I mean, if you had to say, what is this book trying to convince you of, trying to persuade you of, in one sentence, what would you say? And I said, I was thinking out loud the last time we were reading from this, and my answer at the end of the session is one that I still really believe is, trust me. Like, that is the rhetorical claim. And when I say, persuasive claim that Gygax is trying to make to the potential player, somebody who's interested in buying this book, is like, what is kind of the purpose of the book? Sure, it's a set of rules. Sure, it's a set of tables that is trying to show you how to simulate a world. But at the end of the day, the real rhetorical claim, the one thing that Gygax wants you to walk away from, is that he has made the game that can perfectly simulate a fantasy world. You can use this. That's, this is what you need. And the reason I'm thinking about that is because we just got done talking about the accessibility and economy of Shadow Dark. And I think it's interesting that in today's game design environment, we are lauding accessibility, economy, while this book is the exact opposite. It's interesting to me that in 1977, all of the games that were coming out, Rune Quest, all of the competitors, Tunnels of Trolls probably isn't the best example, but Rune Quest, and I'm trying to think, Chivalry and Sorcery, was that the other one that was around? Were all based on giving you more mechanics and more mechanics, more rules, more ways to simulate, more monsters. And of course, a monster block was just getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
I want to quickly you on Tunnels and Trolls, because I believe Ken St. Andre looked at D&D and was like, what a mess. I bet I can do that in 2 pages. And but anyway, go ahead.
Well, that was the exception to the rule. As soon as I said it,
I would agree. I agree.
Yeah. But
and even in the 90s, I remember going to Gen Con and people being like, there's a rule for everything in this book. You can do it. Sorry, I shouldn't use that voice. You you can Midwestern nerd accent, like, oh my God. But people really lauded, there's a rule for anything and you can do anything. You can do anything in my game is still, I think, a terrible reason to buy a game. But now I've really ventured off the topic. Go ahead. Good.
But that's how these companies were building their ethos, right? Like when you were choosing a game in the 1970s. And I don't know if this was true or not, but what the designers were certainly thinking of is that we've got to demonstrate that we have an ethos. We have to demonstrate that we can build a game that can simulate everything. That's how people are going to pick it up. I mentioned the Gary Allen Fine book over and over again, and I've been
I mean,
reading it.
we just need to do a book club of that. So when you and I have time, which
If
we never
anybody,
have.
yeah, if anybody's interested, I mean, from there's so many people are obviously considering the success of your book and Peterson's books and those type of tomes, is that people are really interested in the nascent origins of this hobby. And Gary Allen finds shared fantasy such a wonderful wonderful sociological study exactly of that community. He's interviewing folks. It's really, there's so many things that are fun to think about that book because of how different they are, right? Like I've said many times, there's lots of interviews with folks in the 1970s who were initially playing Dungeons and Dragons, and people are saying things like, oh, Dungeons and Dragons is a bit of a baby game. We play the real stuff. We play chivalry and sorcery. I think that's the game. I can't remember that. I don't know why I can't remember that. And that's a game that I don't even know it necessarily exists anymore. Even games like RuneQuest now kind of exist only on the periphery. Sorry, yes.
Don't say that. Oh my God. So we're gonna have Chaosium people electronically battering down our
I know.
door.
I've never played it either. Now I've stuck my foot in it. I'm sure RuneQuest is fantastic.
So
but
I want to briefly say about the rhetorical claim and all the rules, and my obsession is suspension of disbelief, and what it is that makes us take role-playing games more seriously than make-believe as adults. Like, kids, they can play make-believe and they will take it deadly seriously.
And they don't need any rules to do so.
And they don't need any rules to do so. But we adults, we need dice and rules in order to get us to suspend our disbelief. And I might have said this before, but I kind of feel like early on they were working towards the rules will make you suspend disbelief. Have faith in the rules. The rules are a simulation engine. Therefore, you can suspend your disbelief and roll some dice. I feel like now we've just realized that there's so much more that you can put on the game master and the group and just that trust structure to make you suspend disbelief that you don't need as many rules. And therefore things flow faster. But you want to say anything else, or should I read Speak with Animals?
We should read. The point I initially wanted to make was it's interesting to me about how the ethos of designers has changed from the 1970s to 2024. The concept that now it's more interesting to be like, how few rules can we provide and still make a game, where back then this book is all about we've got to provide every single rule. The only way people are going to the rhetorical claim of trust us right now, we do, because D&D is a trusted practice, right? I've said many times that to me there's nothing revelatory about D&D because, just as you mentioned, kids are always playing make-believe. Professor Malaby, who just had on the show recently, in his definition of game, he talks about it existing in a socially legitimate domain, and that's a fancier way of what I always say is it gives people permission to do something that they want to do. It's funny that we are so when we get together with other adults, we don't necessarily say, hey, let's there's quite a few games that give us a little bit of permission. I'm thinking like murder mystery dinners, if anybody used to do those back in the day, where everybody had to play a little bit of a character. It's really fun to kind of play make believe, but games like D&D of course give us that social legitimacy. They say it's okay to do so, but we have these trappings that make it look like it's okay, that we're not just playing make believe, we're not acting like little kids, we've got a big rule book in front of us, we're playing a game, even though technically whether you're sitting around a table or you're outside running around, you're still, to me, doing the same thing. The only thing that's revelatory about D&D is it just made it socially legitimate. You made the social practice of playing make believe something that adults to do. Last comment, it's interesting though as well, especially thinking about Gary Allen Fine, is back in the 1970s, nobody thought adults would ever play Dungeons and Dragons, right? I mean, a few here and there, and certainly Gygax was playing, but the game had always been designed for like adolescents and teens, and now I'd say that's completely different now. How many here's a question for you, Ben, and then we should read.
Ask me.
How many people in that Shadow Dark line? What was the mean age of a person standing to pick up a signed copy?
I'm going to say 35.
There you go.
I'm just guessing though.
Yeah.
I'm going to say 35, and I'm going to say 80% male. But again, I did not stand there all day. I stopped by a few times. So it's certainly not a scientific measure of anything. Um, but yeah, I mean, again, the OSR is still older, whiter, and maler.
That's yeah. Well, it's those of us who got into the hobby in the 70s, and
Exactly.
back then the hobby was complete. Not only was it designed for teenagers, which a lot of us were back then, it was certainly as we've talked in many problematic fashions, certainly was designed specifically for a male
Yeah.
audience, male
All
middle
right.
class audience.
Let us get to Speak with Animals, which
Let
is
us speak with
a
animals.
second level cleric spell. Uh, it is an alteration spell. Level 2, range 0, duration 2 rounds per level, area of effect. One animal within a 3-inch radius of cleric. Uh, Components, verbal and somatic, casting time 5 segments, saving throw none. Explanation/description. By employing this spell, the cleric is empowered to comprehend and communicate with any warm or cold-blooded animal which is not mindless, such as an amoeba. Okay, I feel like should we stop right there? I think we got one sentence into the description. You want to go first, or should I?
I just want another player who tried to talk to an amoeba. No, please, what are you gonna say?
So, I mean, that kind of makes sense. Like, you know, if what is a mind in an animal is an interesting philosophical discussion, but I am a little weirded out by like all animals are warm-blooded or cold-blooded, right? Unless they're like bacteria or something. So it seems a little, you could just say animal, right?
Right.
Anyway,
If we're going to spend a lot of time talking about I mean, Gygax is kind of,
bombastic writing.
yes, right, kind of infamous for using 13 words where one could have done.
Yeah, and bombastic is such a fun word. And it means using inflated language. I use it all the time, and I'm constantly repeating to students what bombastic means. So hopefully they'll remember forever, and they can use it too because it's so cool.
And for better for worse too, with the Gygaxian prose, right? Like one of the reasons why we can read this and find it fun and interesting is because because he uses 13 words, you often get a little bit more insight into the man himself.
True.
Despite the fact that his rule system, right? We just talked about the economy of Shadow Dark. You could do this a lot, you could do all of this a lot quicker, but it's really fun when one person is writing the book themselves, and they're willing to just keep going in different directions. You get a wonderful viewpoint on their perspective.
Yeah.
It's hard not to talk about Speak with Animals and not talk a little bit about a game that I have not played and yet have read quite a bit about, which is that, Baldur's Gate 3, right? That's the name.
I haven't played it either, but go ahead.
Yeah, people keep telling me that I have to play it, which, if you know anything about me, just makes me say, no, I'm not going to play it then, because contrarianness is defines me. I've been playing Starfield instead, which nobody plays. But my point was, the one of the things I know about is that in this game, and I think the game that Larian Studios had done before Baldur's Gate, they really lean into Speak with Animals. I know that folks are like, oh, you've got to take that spell if you play Baldur's Gate 3 or if you play Divinity Original Sin 2, because Larian poured so much energy into having all of the animals in the world. And the only way you're going to talk with these animals is by taking this spell. Having all of the animals have like backstories and have like full conversations with you. I just think that's pretty cool that Larian Studios took a spell that I don't know how often folks use this, but it's an extremely handy spell if you think about it. I also think it's hard on the DM because, like, how are role playing an orc or role playing the local tavern owner is hard enough when the DM now suddenly has to adopt a squirrel voice to play forest creatures as well.
Well, and again, my religion is one of my obsessions, and one of the things I find interesting about this spell is, unlike many presuppositions in this book, this is a pagan presupposition. This assumes that like animals have this fascinating interior life, which with you can engage if only you could speak the right language. Which is why, so many, pagan stories and old, stories, you'll have people wandering around and animals just talk to people and people talk to animals, and that's totally fine. And this presupposes that kind of world, a world where you can talk to an animal, and if it has a mind, it will tell you some things. All right. The cleric.
That's so
Oh,
fascinating.
sorry, go
I'm
ahead.
saying that's just really fascinating. I mean, I hadn't thought about that. But again, if we talk about the underpinnings of the kind of the religious philosophies that are underpinning Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, you're right. I've never really thought about this, but it does it's kind of positing that, is it positing that animals have a soul? It's certainly positing that they're sentient creatures.
It certainly talks about, again, we could if we got the right academics on here, we could fill hours talking about the word mind alone.
Yeah.
But again, the way he defines it is an animal that is not mindless, such, and it gives the example of an amoeba. But again, he doesn't say brain,
Yeah.
and he doesn't give any further definition. Again, he leaves it really up to the dungeon master to decide. But to me, it creates this fairy tale storybook possibility, where again, like,
Yes.
every animal in a fairy tale can speak and seems in some way equivalent to humans.
It's very Tolkien-esque.
Yeah.
I was always struck in the Tolkien, when you read Tolkien, some of the things I think not necessarily captured by the movies and stuff is that the animals are so kind of vibrant, and they are all talking to it's Middle Earth is a very fairy tale-y
Oh yeah.
place,
Oh yeah.
especially in The Hobbit, I suppose. And
But
this seems to reflect that.
But yeah, like just off the top of my head, there's a part in Fellowship of the Ring where, gosh, I think it's a fox sees Sam, Frodo, Pippin, and Merry walking at night, and the fox thinks to itself, "Four hobbits walking at night? I've never seen anything like that before." And off the fox goes on its merry way and never thinks about the hobbits again, or something like that. Again, I'm regurgitating text from my
Right.
memory. Uh, but yeah, like Tolkien, there's definitely elements of that in Tolkien, and I will not delve into the Silmarillion, in which there are more examples. So let's just keep going.
Yeah.
um, okay. So we're not going to talk about Gygax's theory of mind. The cleric is able to ask questions, receive answers, and generally be on amicable terms with the animal. This ability lasts for 2 melee rounds for each level of experience of the cleric employing the spell. Even if the bent of the animal is opposite to that of the cleric, evil/good, good/evil, it and any others of the same kind with it will not attack while the spell lasts. If the animal is neutral or of the same general bent as the cleric, evil/good, evil/evil, good/good, there is a possibility that the animal and its like associates will do some favor or service for the cleric. This possibility will be determined by the referee by consulting a special reaction chart using the charisma of the cleric and his actions as the major determinants. Note that this spell differs from Speak with Monsters QV, for it allows conversation only with basically normal, non-fantastic creatures such as apes, bears, cats, dogs, elephants, and so on. So, we are told that there's a chart that you need to use to figure out what the animals will do for you. Could it be, Scott, that chart is in the Dungeon Master's Guide, in the place where Gygax would have us expect it to be, which is where he comments on these spells? Is it there? I do not see a chart.
There's no chart. Yeah. I was just looking at that a second ago.
All right, let us read Gygax's DM only comments on this spell. This spell will not necessarily make the animal type being conversed with the good and true friend of the cleric, so terseness and evasiveness are likely in basically hostile and reasonably intelligent creatures. The more stupid ones will make inane comments too. Remember to assume the role of an animal with the appropriate mentality and viewpoint, which doesn't seem totally contradictory, but it does seem like the player's handbook description is much more generous, I would say, than the Dungeon Master's Guide description.
Yeah.
All right. Ooh, we're on third level spells. Should we keep going?
But did he remember to assume the role of an animal with the appropriate mentality and viewpoint? Again, talk about asking the DM to do quite a bit. Like, depending on the animal that the group has chosen to parlay with, that's asking quite a bit, right?
To me, that just sounds so fun. Like, yeah, like, can you converse with a cockroach? Does a cockroach have a mind? Let's assume that it does.
Well,
What is the cockroach going to say?
I mean, the level, the cutoff is amoeba. That's pretty low,
That is pretty
right?
low.
Like, I mean, we're talking about, we can talk to ticks, we can talk to fleas, like, we can. That's kind of amazing. And again, it's going to take it's definitely going to take the game off the rails. It's interesting. While you were reading it and we were talking about, the length, the bombasticness of Gygaxian prose, I was like, it'd be fun. Just let me bring up, and I was looking around here for my Shadow Dark copy, but I was like, oh, I've got a PDF right here. Let's look at the PDF. to see if there's a speak with animals in Shadow Dark, and it'd probably be 3 lines and show the difference between like modern kind of OSR sensibilities. There is no speak with animals in Shadow Dark.
Really? Now that's interesting. Huh.
There's speak with dead, but here's something that I think makes, I don't know, what Kelsey's decision, why not to have speak with animals necessarily. Again, I think that, and for all I know, there's tons of these little zines that add more rules to it. So maybe we do have speak with animals not in the base game. Speak with animals really can take your game in an aesthetic, thematic direction that in many ways I think is not grimmy darky, right? It is once you have your group talking to squirrels and foxes and local animals, it's becoming fairy tale-esque, right? It is, and how do you not let it get silly, right? Once the DM is doing a squirrel voice, it really is. It's not Fritz Leiber. It's definitely more Tolkien. It's even more than that. It's fairy tale-esque. I feel like it's a tricky spell to use and not have it make your game become a bit silly. Do you have any? I can't think of any specific instances of my group in my 1E and 2E games using speak with animals. I don't think they choose it. Have you? Do you remember in a game?
No,
Yeah.
never, but again, I've never played that much D&D. So,
Yeah.
but let me I will say this, the third Shadow Dark zine was the zine's called Cursed Scroll, and I forget the name of it, but it was a Viking setting, and I am a Viking fan. So I'm like, oh, maybe that's it. Maybe I'm gonna Shadow Dark some Viking stuff. That'd be cool. Um, okay. So let us continue. Is there anything else I wanted to say about that? Briefly, I would say that you could have an entire role-playing game based on the characters speaking with animals. And in D&D, it's kind of a one-off throwaway which to me lends to the wild and woolly nature of the game. Like it's a crazy game, right? Like, you know, uh
I've said many times, my friend always said that if Gary Gygax's ambition had been to simulate it's like to read something like Conan the Barbarian or Fritz Leiber, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, this is like the worst game to do it because the game allows so many kind of possibilities in different directions, and there is no, that's kind of an interesting thought. There's no rule or ruling that necessarily says, you must keep to this type of theme, it must always be grimdark, like don't let people get silly. If anything, Dungeons and Dragons has always been defined by the creativity, but also the creative whimsy of players, right? I mean,
all right.
it's interesting. Shadow Dark is trying to bring that kind of Shadow Dark through some of the rules, like the torch rules, is literally trying to bring a sense of foreboding and doom to the game. And so I guess it kind of makes sense that it doesn't have speak with animals, because I suppose that's one of those spells that really can become quite whimsical. I mean, speak with dead can as well, as rather illuminated by the Dungeons and Dragons movie, right?
So I'm gonna throw out here that again, in my 1 year long One Ring campaign, one of the hardest things for me as a game master was typically if I'm in a situation and I'm like, this will increase the drama,
Yeah.
I'm gonna do it, even if it's kind of off brand, a little out of genre. Let's just do it. There's aliens. There's aliens. Like whatever. We're having a great time at the table here. No one's gonna care. But with Tolkien, you really are going for a kind of pre-established mood, tone, and theme. So I had to not do that, and I found that to be a real challenge. And one of the reasons I'm looking forward to actually getting away from it is to get to a place where I can just throw all that wild stuff in again. But that's neither here nor there. With
Well,
that, go
I
ahead.
think it's interesting. I mean, I'm thinking about this concept that, when we do play Dungeons and Dragons, it's often about we do go in kind of whimsical directions, and it's really like at the moment it's really, really fun. One of my long running group, we had to institute something that we call like, actually I don't know what the name but we called it, but like for 2 hours we can't talk about anything except for the game, because we so lean into the social nature of just all kind of hanging out, and we lean into like, making the jokes, the directions, the whimsy that we're like, there's different demand, different, what's the word, different exigencies for the game, I suppose. In that one, like during the game, just the joy of it, the fun, the pleasure that you get out of it, it often becomes, especially from a dungeon master, like there's the dungeon master is asked to do so much, and OSR games even more. And when they see people laughing and smiling around a table, they feel like they're succeeding, right? You've got people that are engaged and happy with the game. But it's interesting is that when you go back and you start creating the narrative about what that experience was about and what the player characters did or what was going on in the game, when you were like, oh, and then we cast Speak with Animals and we had a squirrel, or I don't know, I'm picking on squirrels today. Sorry, squirrels. We cast Speak with Animals or whatever spell you had, and we went in kind of silly, really strange directions that don't necessarily fit what we had initially agreed on as far as the kind of aesthetic of this game. Then you find yourself, well, how do I change that? Because I want a game that's a little darker. I want to and my point is, there's in some ways conflicting exigencies there. That in the moment of the game, people laughing and having a good time is fantastic. But then later, when you make the narrative of the game, and you go back and think about what the initial ambitions of the game were, and you're like, oh, we didn't really succeed. We didn't make a Conan-esque story. We rather made more of kind of a Dungeons and Dragons cartoon, where Presto couldn't find something in his hat. And it was something that again, I keep using the term whimsy, but something that's a little bit sillier. And then how does the game adjust? Because I think often post game there's a different exigency. We're like, whoa, did I actually succeed? Right? There's competing ambitions there, making sure everyone's having a good time, but also, are we creating the game that we wanted to?
Well, this is why horror games like Call of Cthulhu can sometimes be a lift for players.
What a great
Because,
example. Yeah.
yeah, because uh, it's not just the game master. The players also need to refrain from, uh, dumb jokes sometimes. And
Yeah.
again, horror and humor can exist together on a happy continuum, but a lot like you really don't want to walk into the bathroom with a dead body lying in the bathtub in brown water and there's something sloshing in that water and that body is very dead and you can't see what's in the water because of all the blood in it. That's not really the time to make a funny joke like who farted,
Yeah.
like exactly, it totally deflates it, right?
Right.
It totally deflates all the tension from that scene. um
This
Now
is like, yeah,
go
that's
ahead,
why
sorry.
DMing is just so hard, right? I mean, again, I've said this before. If you're a dungeon master, the last thing you want to do is be conscious about what you're doing. And I suppose that's true of any social situation. If we stop and think about like all of the different audiences that we're performing for, we'll go crazy. But it is interesting to me, like how much we ask of dungeon masters in many ways to like keep the theme, keep the flow of the game going. I know that there's games like. It's interesting. I picked up recently Crown and Skull, which I haven't read yet. I've kind of just flipped through it, but that's a game where it puts a lot more of the onus for that on the players.
Hmm.
And I wonder but games like Shadow Dark still lean into the fact that no, the DM is going to be the one who's making the rulings. When you step into these games, you are stepping in, everyone there. I My dissertation was obviously about the agency of creating realities in role-playing games. And one of the things I don't touch on dissertation, which I thought about a lot since, is it is not a, it's certainly the agency in a game for the creation of that reality is not a static thing. And it's not a perfectly equitable thing, right? Not everybody at that table has the exact same amount of agency to create that world. And I think it'd be interesting. I think an academic article on where does agency and where does power for the creation of that world, how does it shift and how does it change, and who has more, who has less, at what moment, I think is an interesting thing because again, the OSR style tends to, I would say, and I may be wrong because I haven't thought this through yet, tends to give more agency to the dungeon master and more responsibilities to the creation of that world, right? Everybody's kind of, I was going to say, because I stopped myself because I say everybody kind of steps into that world. And where is that moment of like, well, how much can the players change? I'm a big fan of having the players have agency, but at the end of the day, the DM still is the final arbiter of how contingent situations in that world you can solicit ideas, but in the end, the DM is the final arbiter of how a contingent situation is going to be adjudicated, right? So does that give more agency to the DM? So, I mean, they get, the players get one book, but there's, five of them around the table, and the DM gets their own book, and there's only one of them. What does that mean? I don't know. What are the equations? What does the math say? I don't know where I'm going anymore.
That's okay. So let's do Speak with Dead. We're gonna get through two spells today. Huzzah.
So Speak with Dead does not have a DM's.
Doesn't it? I thought it did. Hang on, let me look. That's
It
why
goes
I
from
chose
Speak
it.
with Animals. The next one on the advanced DM guide is actually Animate Dead.
Oh yeah, you're right. I'm reading the wrong thing. Animate Dead. Okay, sounds good. Thank you for pointing that
Oh,
out.
no worries.
Let me
Because
flip
I don't
back.
have the player's handbook in front of me. So when you said that, I was like, oh, that's not here.
All right. Animate Dead, not Speak with Dead. Thank you. So, it is a necromantic spell, level 3, range 1 inch, duration permanent. Wow. Area of effect special. Components verbal, somatic, and material. Casting time 1 round, saving throw none. Explanation/description. This spell creates the lowest of the undead monsters, skeletons or zombies, from the bones or bodies of dead humans. The effect is to cause these remains to become animated and obey the commands of the cleric casting the spell. The skeletons or zombies will follow, remain in an area, and attack any creature or just a specific type of creature entering the place, etc. The spell will animate the monsters until they are destroyed or until the magic is dispelled. See Dispel Magic Spell. The cleric is able to animate 1 skeleton or 1 zombie for each level of experience he or she has attained. Thus, a second level cleric can animate 2 of these monsters, a third level cleric 3, etc. The act of animating dead is not basically a good one. Is that right? Let me read that again. The act of animating dead is not basically a good one. He's really hedging some things there.
Yeah.
And it must be used with careful consideration and great reason by clerics of good alignment. It requires a drop of blood, a piece of human flesh, and a pinch of bone powder or a bone shard to complete the spell. Um, yeah, it is interesting that he does not immediately say, if you're good, you can't use this at all. He leaves some wiggle room there. That's kind of interesting. All right.
This I was just talking about like agency and the difference between the players, and I was between the players and the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's interesting by reading these two books back to back, because we're going from the AD&D Player's Handbook to now the AD&D DMG Guide. The AD&D Player's Handbook is very much like, this is what you could do as a player, and then the DMG Guide is like, this is what they can't do. Right? Like that's literally what it's like. All right, this is what you guys
that does
think,
seem to be the dynamic.
right? To stop them from doing this.
All right.
One
Third
is about
level.
agency, one is about limited. One is about providing and providing agency, and one is very much around how to limit it, which is
The
I think
Lord
is
giveth
interesting.
and the Lord taketh away.
Right. Good way to put it.
All right. Animate dead. It is, of course, possible to animate the skeletons or corpses of demi-human and humanoid as well as human sort. I'm going to
What
read
the
that
heck?
sentence again. It is, of course, possible to animate the skeletons or corpses of demi-human and humanoid, comma, as well as human, comma, sort.
What?
That might be the worst sentence we've read in this entire book.
It is, of course, possible to animate the skeletons or corpses of demi-human and humanoid as well as human sort. Okay.
I gotta write this down. The worst sentence?
What?
Question mark. Okay. If creatures with more than a basic 1 hit die or 1+ hit die are so animated, the number of such skeletons or zombies will be determined in hit dice rather than in total numbers. Thus, a cleric of 6th level could animate 6 skeletons of human or humanoid sort, which in life had less than 2 hit dice. 3 such undead, which in life had less than 3, but 2 or more hit dice, or a single undead creature which had 6, but less than 7 hit dice. For each such additional hit die, the skeleton or zombie will gain another die. Thus, the animated skeleton of a fire giant, an 11 hit die monster, is 10 over the norm for a skeleton normally animated, so it would have 1 plus 10 hit dice, 11d8. Likewise, a fire giant zombie would have 10 dice over and above the sort of creature typically made into a zombie, so it would have 2 plus 10 hit dice, 12d8. NB. Do you know what NB means?
No, I was hoping that you did.
All right. NB. Noto bene. Noto bene, right? Which I think just means good note in Italian.
I mean, bene means good.
Yeah. See if I'm right. Can I get
I'm going to the answer machine right
Yeah.
now.
So there's an
Oh,
NB in
yeah.
the book.
Used in writing to make somebody take notice of a particular. This is courtesy of the Oxford Learner's Dictionary. Used in writing to make somebody take notice of a particular piece of information that is important. From the Latin nota bene.
Oh, okay. That is so. In other words, this just says please note, right?
Yeah.
In perhaps the most obscure way possible, Gygax has. You could just write please note. Instead, we get bold N period, bold B period, colon. So, nota bene. This does not enable a cleric to make skeletons or zombies of characters of second or higher level have more hit dice. Such undead are simply human skeletons or zombies with 1 or 2 hit dice, nothing more. In other words, somebody in Gygax's game was like, I'm gonna go resurrect some monsters.
Yeah. Yes.
Because all that note says is, hey, if they resurrect monsters, that doesn't work. You can really see there, I think. I want to say the publication order was Monster Manual in 77, Player's Handbook in 78, and DMG in 79. And you can almost see those rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide because in the Player's Handbook, there would be nothing stopping you from going and resurrecting a dragon skeleton with that rule, right?
But this goes back to, yeah, absolutely, right? And this goes back to the 1970s because people were, again, I mean, one of the things that's different around why Shadow Dark can come out now and not provide you with all of the rulings is because people have been somewhat interpolated, or some are now somewhat familiar to the concept of what a role-playing game is, right? But back then, nobody was, and everybody was playing a much more antagonistic style game, right? One of the reasons why, well, how much of these rules in the Advanced Dungeon Masters, guys, 75%, I'd say like 70, 60, 70% of some of these rules are literally Gary knowing how players have abused the system and saying, don't let them do this, right? If you do, it'll kind of ruin your game. And it in many ways, the D&D has a little bit of a voice that sounds a bit antagonistic, or not antagonistic, but definitely saying, pushing back and be like, this is how you're going to have to push back against your players, because in the 1970s, people were playing Dungeons and Dragons often to win. The Dungeon Master was viewed as your opponent because people were more familiar with games with opponents and less with games that were kind of cooperative style problem-solving mechanisms, like I think that we view tabletop role-playing games now. Right? I mean, the whole concept of Tomb of Horrors, the whole concept of many of those modules was, here is how can you get through this? People were still thinking in that concept of like, how do we win? So how do we win? We break the system. And of course we still have this, the term min-max player is same concept of somebody who's playing to win necessarily. Right?
Wow. Even though we only went through 2 spells, I feel like we actually covered a lot today.
Yeah. All this stuff brings up, I mean, especially if you're interested in the stuff and you're interested in what the ambition of Gygax was, it's so hard not to just get interested in it. It's interesting to like the reason to me that this is such a compelling piece. And I said this earlier in just today's podcast, because it was written by one human being who makes a lot of mistakes and who is given us so much prose to look over. You really get insights into what was happening in the 1970s, what the design philosophies was. It's weird. I always think tabletop role-playing game is such an intimate practice, but I think in some ways these rules, I mean, I would say, like, to use a word that I don't know if is perfect. In some ways, I feel like there's a vulnerability to Gygax being this kind of open around the game, right? You really do get insights into his design philosophies.
This is an awful lot to throw out as we're trying to end the show,
right?
But I'm just going to say, it is also, I think, significant that he was involved in the management of the company that was publishing these books.
Right, of course.
I forget if he was CEO or president at the time, but he like Lawrence Schick, who edited this. Gosh, he was a couple years out of college. Gygax was 20 years older and had created D&D. And Gygax is like, here's the Dungeon Master's Guide, kid. You're editing it. And Lawrence Schick is brilliant. He worked on Baldur's Gate 3. I'm sure he did the best he could with what he got and what he could do at that time. But like this you're gonna, I think, end up with that stronger authorial voice and those mistakes, because maybe Lawrence Schick was afraid to go and say to the boss, "Hey, boss, maybe this part doesn't make sense when we compare it to the player's handbook."
Yeah, there's no reason to end a sentence with the word sort.
Yeah.
I mean, it is, of course, possible. It's funny to me because I was an editor for a long time, and I see that sentence and I'm just like, okay, it is, of course, possible. Like, all of this is really lengthy. We could really make this much more. E.B. Strunk would, tell you we could quickly make this much more stylistically accessible, but you would lose something in that, right?
You certainly do. You do lose some charm and some voice, but
Yeah.
again, we are reading this as archaeologists, nostalgists. We're looking at this through a very different lens
Yeah.
than a 12-year-old would have in 79. Anyway, with that, I want to say again, if you join our Patreon, you will get access to my 4th edition seminar from Gen Con last year, telling you the history of 4th edition, its whys, hows, wherefores, etc., etc., etc. And you can get access to that for a mere $3 a month, and we're going to keep dropping amazing content on you for the foreseeable future. You can find this podcast on YouTube, Libsyn, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. I really hate that Google Podcasts is no more because it was great. And with that, anything else you need to add, Scott?
No, I can't believe that at the end of the session, I'm just realizing that I'm about to be running a Shadow Dark game for people that are Patreon subscribers shortly. So again, if you guys are actually interested in playing Shadow Dark, we've kind of talked about it and playing it with a group of folks that that will be, yeah, there's going to be running a Shadow Dark game that's going to be affiliated with the podcast. So again, another reason to throw your $3 towards us. But yeah.
All right, then with that, I will simply close by saying I'm Ben Riggs.
I'm Dr. Scott M. Bruner. Yeah, I'll see you next time.
All right, bye-bye.